All right, headed into first Gemini Man screening. We're starting off with 3D high frame rate UltraAVX DBOX.
I think I know why he's as good as you. He is you.
All right, I'm back at the theater for my second showing of Gemini Man, the 2D 24 frames per second version of this film. So earlier today I saw the 3D 60 FPS version, and I have so much to say that I don't know what I want to say, and that's wobbling again. It like wobbles every time I move, and that's probably going to be looking bad because 60 frames shows off all the wobble. My impressions of the 60 FPS version are not good. This movie, to me, it looked incredibly cheap. The 60 frame, the high frame rate, like I kind of wish I could see the 120 version, because I'm curious if it even looks appreciably different to the 60, like if it's perceptibly different to the 60 FPS. I suspect not. Maybe. Who knows? It looked like a made-for-TV movie. It looked like a very special episode of a sitcom. It looked like the episode of a sitcom where they go to an amusement park or the beach, or the action scenes looked like they were lifted out of Baywatch. The high frame rate just takes a lot of the energy out of some already, like, I don't know, like I got the impression that the action would look pretty limp in any version. And so we'll see with the 24, but like, a lot like Glass, in that like the action is just kind of wet noodle. It's limp, it's cold, very, very like blandly shot, very blandly framed, very blandly lit. The 120 FPS plus 3D requires so much light that they're heavily reliant on just sunlight. A lot of outdoor locations in bright daylight, and very, very little sculpting to the light, very little, shaping of shadows. You kind of get the impression that it's like they had very limited access to a lot of the locations that they were shooting on, and so it's that like, okay, well, we can be like right over here and we can only be here for 2 days, and so we kind of need to get everything, and so we need to shoot efficiently, and that ends up showing in the finished product with the fact that it's like everything is just kind of bare bones. There's no like real craft to the way that anything is really like shot and composed. The way that actors are blocked within the frame and the way that they move relative to one another is just, it's very utilitarian, which again is like, these are the kind of hallmarks that you end up seeing in like a made-for-TV movie, or you end up seeing in the beach episode of a TV show, like of a sitcom that's shooting on tape, and they're like, well, we got all the actors to Disneyland and we've only got like 2 days that we can be doing like outdoor shots. Like we've got 4 hours in front of the castle, and that's it. That's our window, and we need to get literally everything that we need there done in that time. And it ends up being like fundamentally very unambitious, very uninteresting. And there are a few, like, you can tell the set pieces where they did have time and they did put in like a ton of energy, and that shows, and those are like the most interesting parts of the movie. You know, like there's a big set piece towards the end of the movie where the characters are avoiding like minigun fire, and that comes close to kind of showing you like what 60 FPS could do. But at the same time, I'm sitting there and I'm watching it, and it's like, okay, I already know what this looks like at 60 frames or at 120 frames or at 240, because I've seen it at that frame rate before in every other action movie where they take this, they shoot it at that frame rate, and then they play it back at 24. And so it's slow-mo. Like, you see a lot of high frame rate stuff in movies anyway. It's all slow-mo, and the current cinematic language of film encompasses that, and it encompasses a higher temporal resolution in the form of slow motion, which is a lot more malleable. There's more you can do with it. You can shape slow motion in a lot of ways that you can't necessarily shape high frame rate, because when you raise your floor like that, you've got to go even higher and higher in order to like get that stuff. And there's a very limited amount of slow-mo in this, which means that, and it's not much. It's like they were shooting at 120 and they were maybe going up to like 160, 200. Maybe like there was one shot in there where they went up to like 240. Which gives you a 50% slowdown. And now the thing is a 50% slowdown isn't that much. Half speed is like barely slow-mo for a lot of purposes. Like, half speed is what you would be shooting if you were just kind of shooting like product shots where you wanted to get like that extra kind of clarity and stability out of the out of slowing, like, you know, out of slowing it down. Like, you know, any camera shake is going to get kind of smoothed out by that. And oh boy, camera shake, like every jitter of the camera registers as to its microscopic details. Like, you can feel all of the jitters, and not in a good way. It's not interesting, it's not fun, it's not engaging. This movie is not a good demonstration of the strengths of 60 FPS, and makes me wonder if 60 FPS has, or so I shouldn't keep saying 60 FPS of high frame rate, that it makes me wonder if high frame rate has any narrative strengths at all. And I want it to, because I think it's an interesting tool. I think there is potential for high frame rate. It just takes the right people to figure it out. And at the moment, having seen the high frame rate version of Gemini Man, this is not that. You know, if like Michael Bay were doing high frame rate, or Zack Snyder were doing high frame rate, I think this would be a very different story. At the very least, it would be lit better. It would not look like it would not look like made for TV. And it was some of the worst 3D I've seen in quite a while. The grade, the color grade is just bad. And I don't just mean like, it's just really limp. It's lame. There was a whole bunch of scenes super overexposed, and they had these really wide latitudes, and they had a lot of like really like wide dynamic range shots. You know, it's like, oh, we're indoors, but you can resolve the stuff that's outside the window. And we didn't put gels on the window. Like, look, you can actually like hold all that. And it's like, okay, like that's kind of neat. You know, like that's technically interesting, but it's not shaped and it's not really used well. And it's like, whatever. But then there's a bunch of shots where it's just like, it's on the border of being blown out, but then they've like brought it back down, but they didn't. And I'm wondering if this had to do with like the 3D version that I was seeing. Like, is this just an artifact of like the 2K 3D 60 FPS? Like, will I see this same problem in the 2D version? I don't know. We're going to see going into it. But like so they're up at clipping, and then they just kind of took it and like lowered it. But so the clipping point, you know, your pure white, things that are approaching that don't get dimmer. The white just goes down, and it ends up, so instead of everything going up to pure white, it just goes up to slightly below pure white. And so pure white is just dimmer. And that might have been an artifact of the 3D. Like, they might have been clipping out, and then like you take that and add the dimming of the glasses, and it ends up looking muddy. You know, I don't know yet. We'll see when I've got something to compare it to. So a thing that I'm wondering is like, is it going to look as cheap at 24 frames 2D, like without the glasses, without the high frame rate? Is it going to look as cheap? Is it going to look as boring? Is the lighting going to be as uninteresting? Is the framing going to be as uninteresting? Is the blocking going to be as uninteresting? And maybe I'll actually be able to talk about the movie as a story, which I don't know, like, it completely bounced off me. And it seemed to bounce off like the entire audience that I was with earlier today. It wasn't a full theater, but it wasn't an empty theater. Okay, it was a mostly empty theater. I saw it in a mostly empty theater earlier today, but there were other people there, and I don't remember if there was a single, like, comedy relief moment, or, like, tense moment, or just, like, wow moment that got any kind of audible reaction from the audience. I don't remember any comic relief moment. I don't even know if there was comedy in this movie. And oh wait, no, there were some jokes at the end, and they felt like a sitcom. Which was really bizarre, because the end of this movie, up until like the closing scene, is pretty grim. And if you're using high frame rate, you're doing so to try to create reality or hyper reality, but this is not doing anything with hyper reality. It's neither realistic enough to exploit the reality element of that, you know, make you feel like you're watching something that like maybe actually happened. Like 60 FPS is maybe going to be like best suited for, you know, found footage or something like that, like a horror film. You know, I think there's a lot of room in that. Like, if you're trying to exploit the fact that things look real, and if you're trying to exploit the fact that, like, so one of the quirks of high frame rate is that the higher your frame rate goes, the closer things look to reality. The problem is with narrative film then is that reality is not necessarily your constructed reality or the reality you're attempting to construct. The reality is a bunch of actors standing around acting at each other. And, you know, you see this a lot in Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk, if you watch the high frame rate version of that, where there's like all of the extras in these crowd shots. You become keenly aware of the fact that they're extras who are miming crowd actions, like, and like, you know, they're moving their hands a lot, and they're just trying to look busy, and they're pointing at things in ways that like nobody does in real life. And it's like, okay, it looks fake. You look like actors. You have exposed the reality of the fact that your movie is a bunch of actors pretending to do stuff. And you know, that's a thing that you need to like incorporate or accept or overcome. And Billy Lynn does not manage to do that, and Gemini Man does a better job but doesn't do a good job. And, you know, on the other end would be like you're using it to construct hyper reality. And this is where I think, like, this is kind of why I say, like, I want to see like a Michael Bay or a Zack Snyder do something with it, where you're going all in on just absurdity. You're escalating to just this comical degree, and you're constructing a world that is so divorced from reality that it becomes its own substance. And I think if you're going that far, then like, who knows? Like, what happens if you then take that and raise it to raise the frame rate on it? And I think that would be maybe where you would see something interesting coming out of that, where you're constructing, like, you're not just like presenting hyper reality, you are constructing a reality worthy of being hyper real. Because otherwise you're calling attention to all this stuff. And Billy Lynn had a lot of this fakeness, like tons of problems with this fakeness, and a lot of also problems with the fact that it's limited by its budget. You know, these are both expensive movies, but that expense seems to be very unevenly distributed. It's all in post-production. It's all in camera department and post-production, and like none of it is in lighting, none of it is in sets, none of it is in getting that key thing that you need. You know, you watch Billy Lynn and it's very obvious that, you know, like Beyonce is there, and it's super obvious that it's not Beyonce because they're always showing the back of her head in this really obvious way, which, when combined with the fact that the movie already looks and feels like a sitcom, just becomes even more comical, because now you're looking at something that already looks like a sitcom and is now using a sitcom trope of like, oh, here's this, the gang meets a famous person, but we can't actually afford the famous person to like show up and shoot our 22-minute sitcom, so it's always the back of their head. You know, the gang meets Elton John, but it's just some actor kind of dressed like Elton John with a wig on, and they walk into frame and you always see them from behind. And you know, it's using that trick, and it uses it multiple times very obviously, and it's like, okay, this plays in a sitcom because a sitcom is this cheap thing, and it's principally about like banter and character interactions and a little bit of slapstick. Doesn't really play for your war movie about PTSD. Doesn't really play for your action film about, I don't know what this movie's about. I don't know what Gemini Man is about. It's Will Smith, government assassin, wants to retire, and his asshole ex-boss sends his clone to kill him. That's it. You know, there's not really a message. So anyway, I'm gonna go get some snacks, and let's go see Gemini Man for a second time.
Hello, and welcome to my latest tutorial, how to grade like Gemini Man. So, we've got this footage from New York. It's pretty wide in terms of its dynamic range, but you can see over here on the scopes that whoever shot it did a good job at protecting the highlights. So, we've got a lot to work with here. Now, as always, the first thing we're going to do is slap a LUT on it. So just find your favorite LUT and slap it in there. There we go. Now, since this is the Gemini Man look we're going for, we will naturally be exhibiting in 3D, which means we need colors to really pop, pop, pop to make up for the 3D glasses. So add a node and just grab that saturation and crank it right on up. And you know what? Let's do it again. Just add another node and just keep on turning it up. Just crank it. Just crank it right on up. A good rule of thumb here is that if the audience can look at a color without experiencing physical discomfort, then you've got some room to turn it up. Okay, so now that that is painful to look at, we check our waveform and we're definitely clipping out and are no longer DCI compliant for exhibition. So how about we just add another node and let's just clamp that off. And yeah, that's, you know what? That's all you really need to do to recreate the deeply uncomfortable experience of watching a substantial chunk of professionally made film Gemini Man.
All right, well, I'm out of the movie. I made it about halfway through the 4DX version with the giant the giant motion sim seats and the scent wafting throughout the theater, which never failed to smell like anything more than the generic idea of scent. It didn't. You would just. Okay, so 4DX. Okay, so 4DX is a new thing. It's part of the whole like value added cinema experience, along with things like 3D and high frame rate and
dynamic seat movements, roll, heave, and pitch with the on-screen action. Water effects spray through the theater. Wind effects recreate a turbulent storm or the sensation of speed. Lightning flashes just inches away. Scent adds a new dimension of realism. Fog adds drama to the scene. Bubbles bring a buoyant atmosphere to life. A tickler adds vibration to your legs for a full body experience. And floating snow adds a dreamlike effect. With over 20 different effects, 4DX is the movie experience you just have to see and feel to believe. See your next movie in 4DX, only at Cineplex.
Okay, battery died. So 4DX is part of the whole, like, it's part of the value-added cinema experience, along with 3D, high frame rate, all of this other stuff. Basically, gimmicks that they're trying to add that can't be really easily or affordably replicated at home, and are thus something that you kind of have to go to the theater to experience.
A tickler adds vibration to your legs.
I don't know. I ranted about this whole bunch before I realized the battery was dead, and they're just they're just neither, like, it's not awful, like, you know, that motion sim experience, but like it really did not suit this movie and wasn't particularly interesting. And like, okay, so like the 4DX, you're in a bench of like 4 seats that all move together, and that's kind of interesting, you know, in kind of what it can do, and the range of motion as a result is a little more extreme. It's also more precise, like the motions are less jittery, they're more fluid, but they're also just more extreme as a baseline, where the D-box seats, like, you have an individual control on like how intense you want your seat to be, and so like you can actually like shut it off, and if it's just, you know, too obnoxious, you could just turn it off. The real problem with the 4DX, so the seat motion got tiring. The scents never smelt like anything at all. Like, they just smelled like the idea of scent. The real problem was that they have a strobe or I guess what is supposed to be several strobes, or at least two different strobes, up at the top that go off for things like lightning strikes, gunfire, stuff like that. Basically anything that would be an on-screen flash, the strobe flashes and enhances the experience. But like, I don't know if the system just sucks, or if there was something broken about this theater, because only the strobe on my right hand side, so the right hand side of the theater, only that strobe was going off, and so it was just constantly like only ever coming in like one side. And strobes are annoying as hell at the best of times, and then having a strobe only like strobe one side of your vision is immeasurably worse. And so after I made it about halfway through the movie, and it was just like, no more, and went out and talked to guest services and switched into the IMAX 4K screening that started a little bit after the one that I was, the 40X one that I was in. So I have seen all or part of 3 different formats. Now, going into, and there's problems with all of them. So going into the 4K version was actually kind of really, really interesting. One, it took me a while just to adjust to being stationary again and just be like enjoying watching a movie in just a reclining seat, and the motion cadence is at least ordinary, and things look, I don't want to say normal because they didn't, but you're not being overwhelmed. But the higher resolution, so jumping up from 2K to 4K, all of a sudden the movie now has a high enough resolution that you can see like the edges on power windows in the grade. Like there's like fringing around characters' faces against the sky. Junior's look like just a lot more flaws are obvious in 4K that were actually pretty well hidden in 2K. Like you start to really notice that like his nose isn't right, like the upper lip, like just kind of this whole area, like the upper lip and the nose, like it doesn't behave properly. And that's really obvious actually at the end of the movie when a second Junior is like dying and the soundtrack has this really like labored breathing, but his nose, like the nostril flare, there's no nostril flare. And so like even though there's this like really heavy breathing, nose breathing, like you're not getting that labored kind of tension in the face, and like so the face just looks overly static. And yeah, I mean, but like creating a CG person, like photorealistic human, is like really hard, and credit for coming as far as they have. But it's just ironic that this movie that is fetishizing technology to such a degree looks worse at its higher end versions, that the higher up you go, the more flaws appear, because if they had focused on finishing this for a 2K delivery, like if that had been their primary delivery with the tech pipeline that they have in like that Junior's rendering, like it would look amazing. Like it does look pretty good, but it would blow everything away if they had been able to focus on like, okay, we're going to like maximize all of the things that are going to be visible in a 2K delivery, and use the fact that we're delivering at a lower temporal resolution and a lower just actual geometric resolution, pixel resolution, use that to hide imperfection and allow imagination to take over, allow the audience's brain to take over and do a lot more heavy lifting with guessing and filling things in and whatnot, and it would work so much better. But nothing is going to make up for the fact that, like, it's just a boring movie and is just really underwhelming and limp and ineffective, confusing, not particularly interesting. At the end of the day, the critical flaw here is the film itself. It's none of the technology, you know, the technology at best like distracts from it, maybe. But it is ultimately just a really underwhelming film. So going to the 24 FPS version, a lot of the problems that I identified in the high frame rate version still exist in terms of like the blocking, the framing, camera movement, acting, line delivery, the script itself. It no longer looks, it still looks like TV. It's just that it looks like an episode of 24 or Homeland instead of looking like an episode of Full House. The grade, it's less muddy than it was in 3D, but it was pretty much what I was guessing, which was that it's really over compressed in the highlights, really oversaturated in a lot of ways, and that like that has been like brought down, and then you add the 3D glasses on top of it, and that gave it this muddy look. But even seeing it in without the 3D glasses, like it's still like the highlights are just really squashed in a lot of places, and the saturation is cranked so high, like probably to compensate for 3D glasses. Like that you're watching, if you watch the 2D version, you were probably not, like I was probably not watching a version that had been properly prepared for 2D presentation, and it's just been kind of tweaked. You know, like they hadn't gone through and given it like a careful grade. They had just been like, okay, we start with the 3D version and compensate for the glasses, and then pull it back by 5% and ship it for the 2D version. And it looks bad. I mean, it already looked bad with 3D glasses on. It does not look good in either version. It's so compressed in the highlights. It's so just like, it ends up being flat and washed out, and in a lot of places. So if you raise colors way too high, like if you raise the saturation way too high so that they come up like either clipping or right under clipping, and then you kind of lower everything, you create this odd optical effect where something is simultaneously dull looking but way too bright, because it's kind of both at the same time. Like, so it looks overexposed, but the literal luminance value is below the point that you would expect it to be, and so it messes with the brain. It looks weird. Yeah, all the outdoor stuff, and there is a lot of outdoor stuff because it relies on it, just does not look good. And there's a lot of really just like bland day for night shooting, because again they need just so much light for these cameras that they're using and shooting at 120 FPS that, you know, they can't actually shoot in the dark. They can't actually shoot at night, and like lighting convincingly at night. They do it a couple times in like city locations where they're able to like actually shoot at night and just use, you know, lamps and stuff like that to get the light level that they need. But then there's just a ton of stuff like out on the boats that's all, it's all day for night with a sky replacement, and looks cheap, doesn't look great, doesn't look like the kind of thing that, you know, is up to the conceptual level of what you would expect from a movie where they're like, yeah, we're gonna shoot at just this absurd frame rate, and we're gonna do it in 3D as well, and we're gonna go all out on these two things and cut everything else in order to accommodate that. And that was Billy Lynn. That's Gemini Man. There's a whole thing with, there's just some bad editing, like just really sloppy coverage of conversations. This was in Billy Lynn as well. And it happened again in Gemini Man, where you'll have like 3 or 4 characters talking to each other, and like eye lines and stuff will just go wherever. The angles of the characters are being covered from will just flip around. The axis of action is wherever they want it to be for any given shot. You'll get a number of shots where like characters like stare directly into the lens. Oh, my light went out. So you get a whole bunch of moments where characters are either like looking directly into the lens, or even worse, they have an eye line that is like right beside the lens. And so they're not looking into the camera, but they're not really looking away from the camera either. And when it's on this, when that image is on this giant screen, that difference is really noticeable and really unsettling. And what else haven't I talked about yet? I mean, the story itself, I already mentioned, is limp and bland, and it amazingly manages to suck any sort of like philosophical tension out of the idea of like cloning. That Will Smith confronts his own clone, but they treat it so realistically, in the sense that like his clone is like 23, so his clone was like made 23 years ago and is growing up, you know, in real time like a normal human being, and isn't, you know, sci-fi accelerated growth super soldier or anything like that. So if you want clones 20 years from now, you got to start growing them now. And the side effect of that is that the reality kind of sets in of like, oh, well, a clone really isn't that different from a child, like from just having a kid. And that even if Will Smith's clone is genetically identical to him, the relationship really is pretty damn close to just being father-son, like age difference wise between them. And, you know, there's this really funny line that shows up in the trailer where Junior says, "You made a person out of another person." And it's like, yeah, man, that's genetics. That's how babies work. Like, that's what a baby is. And it ends up being really funny. And also just like, I guess this is the thing I'll go out on. The trailer presents a far more interesting story than the movie itself actually is, because the trailer is principally told from Junior's point of view. So if you watch the trailer, you're given the impression that you're watching a movie about a kid who's like this born and raised assassin who's being sent out on this hit. and then he realizes that his job is to kill the person that he's being cloned from. And that's the opposite of the story as it's told in the actual movie. Because it's the opposite, because you're not really you don't really in the film get a point where Junior really grapples with like the fact that he's a clone. And when they try to do it in the scene where it's like, you made a person out of another person, there's not really an existential crisis to that. The bigger existential crisis, the bigger crisis in that conflict is really just the fact that he was lied to about his parentage. Because they've made being a clone so bland that it's no different than if the antagonist was like, oh yeah, we just stole you from a maternity ward and then told you that your parents died in a car crash. And it's like, well, you lied to me. Like, I have parents out there. You know, it's basically the same as that. He's more hung up on the fact that he was told he's an orphan than any sort of identity crisis of being a clone, because again, in the world that they've constructed, there really isn't an identity crisis to be had about being a clone, because it's not that different than just being someone's child. And also, like, it's worth noting that they raise the fact that a clone would require a surrogate mother, and nary a word of that is ever mentioned again. She's never brought up. She's never identified. No one cares about her or who she is or what her role in all of this was or what happened to her. What happened to the woman who was involved in this illegal human cloning super soldier program? What happened to the rest of the women involved in the illegal secret super soldier cloning program? Because there's Junior number 2 who has been genetically edited to not feel pain or fear or whatever, and none of that. Just and the other interesting thing about the trailer, which I have now finally seen after seeing 3 versions of this film, I finally went and watched the trailer, and the grade in the trailer is better. The trailer actually makes use of a lot of slow-mo that doesn't exist in the movie itself, which makes sense that if you're cutting a trailer and somebody has handed you, a box full of 120 FPS footage, it's all footage that if you're cutting a 24 FPS trailer, you can do whatever you want with it. And like any subtle or extreme amount of slow-mo you want to create is all just going to look buttery smooth. And so there's a bunch of shots in the trailer that are slowed down a conventional amount. There's a conventional amount of time warping going on with them in order to amplify the intensity of the of the moment. And it's not extreme, but it's there. And the trailer also does include the 3 shots in the actual movie that do have slow-mo. Those are included in the trailer as well, at basically the amount of slow-mo that you would see if you go see it in theaters. But then there's a bunch of other shots that have the slow-mo added to them because they could. And it's really interesting to see the trailer make better use of the tools for cinematic storytelling than the movie that it is pulling from. I know that's not unusual for a trailer to be better than a movie, but it's interesting for those technical tools to be better utilized, and for that 120 FPS footage that they grabbed to be better utilized. And also, it's really fascinating to me that all of the high frame rate films to this point, I think Billy Lynn is the only one that has released a high frame rate trailer. There might be a high frame rate trailer for Gemini Man out there. I didn't find it on a cursory search, but I mean, searching for movie trailers get re-uploaded so many times in so many different places that finding a specific version can be challenging. So there might be one out there, but I did not find it. And it is certainly not the one that is surfaced when you do an initial search. It's not the first thing to come up. So they have not done, if high frame rate is an element of the movie that they're trying to emphasize, they've done a bad job of emphasizing that by not making it easy for audiences to find and engage with. And this is a bigger problem with high frame rate as a whole in a cinematic scope, and I'll get more into that later, but I feel like that's at least 80% of what I want to say about Gemini Man. So to close this out, here's that bit with the tickler again.
A tickler adds vibration to your legs for a full body experience. Heave with the on-screen action.